She passed away in silence. He sat by the bed, holding her hand. No one in the family wanted him to stay. No one called his name, until he pulled out a piece of paper with 2 words, "Spouse, David Sinclair," and the entire room fell silent. Before we dive into the story, please like this video and leave a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Your support is what keeps us going, bringing you stories that carry real weight and move the heart. Let's begin. Dim sunlight slanted through the dusty glass window of room 307 at St. Adelaide Memorial Hospital. The heart monitor kept beeping steadily, slow, deliberate, like it was counting down the final moments. Elena Whitmore lay motionless on the bed. Her face was pale, delicate, hauntingly beautiful in that stillness. Beside her, a black man sat silently, gripping her hand as if he alone was holding on to the fragile thread of her life. His name was David Sinclair, and to everyone else in the room, he was nothing more than a stranger. Across from him stood Vivian Whitmore, Elena's mother, in an elegant smoke-grey dress, the pearl necklace on her collarbone trembling faintly like clinking glass. She looked at David with cold confusion, her gaze sharp and unreadable. Next to her, Henry Whitmore, Eleanor's father, stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring down at the parking lot below. No one spoke, no one asked who the man was. And strangely, no one dared to. Suddenly, a soft voice came from the doorway. Nurse Elena Torres stepped inside, her tone gentle yet firm. "Mr. Sinclair, we need to confirm the designated representative for final procedures. The next of kin form is in Ms. Elena's records, correct?" David nodded, not a flicker of hesitation. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folder, yellowed with age, its corners slightly curled. With quiet composure, he opened it slowly, like a man who had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. Then he turned the document toward the light, pointing to a bold line just beneath the signature. "Next of kin, David Sinclair, spouse." The air vanished from the room. A suffocating silence fell. Vivian's eyes widened, her face drained of color, as if someone had slapped her with something she couldn't see. Henry paused, furrowed his brow slightly, but said nothing. David offered no explanation. He simply folded the paper, gently placed it back into his coat, as if it were nothing unusual. Then he turned to Elena again, took her hand, and whispered something so quietly. No one heard it. But they all saw he didn't shed a single tear. And he didn't need to, because it was clear to everyone he was the man who had loved Elena for a lifetime. David remained seated, unmoving, his hand still clasped tightly around Elena's, a hand that was slowly growing colder, as if it were slipping away from this world inch by inch. No one in the room said a word, no words of thanks, not even a nod of acknowledgement. Only a heavy silence, like an invisible wall rising between him and everyone else in that room. Vivian Whitmore glanced at David again, her eyes full of things she couldn't bring herself to say. Discomfort, contempt, and the unwillingness to accept the truth that was now staring her in the face. She turned away, dabbing the corner of her eye with a handkerchief, not out of sorrow, but embarrassment. Then her gaze landed on the small wedding ring on Elena's finger, catching the light with a defiant sparkle. Only now did she truly see it, but she quickly looked away, as if it had never been there. In the corner of the room, Henry Whitmore stood motionless at the window, hands clasped behind his back. No one knew what he was thinking. His face gave away nothing. He was a man who had long since grown used to not asking questions. David didn't look at anyone. He didn't have to. Every avoided glance, every shake of the head, every furrowed brow, he felt it all. But he chose not to react, because he wasn't there to argue, wasn't there to prove anything, wasn't there to win anyone over. He was there for one reason and one reason only: to keep a promise to the woman who chose him, even when the whole world turned its back. In a room full of people but devoid of warmth, there was only one person who sat close to Elena. Not for status, not for appearances, but for love. In the sterile white hospital room, time moved painfully slow. David still sat beside Elena, his hand resting gently over hers. but his mind had already drifted back to the years they shared, the years no one else ever knew about. There had once been quiet mornings in their little kitchen, Elena brewing coffee, hair hastily tied back, eyes still drowsy. David would wrap his arms around her from behind, kiss her shoulder and tease, "So, are you ever going to let them know I exist?" Elena would chuckle softly, but she never answered, and then, as if by ritual, before every holiday, she would slip off her wedding ring and place it in the drawer of her vanity. Put on the pearl earrings her mother had given her and say, "I'm going home for a bit, I won't be long." And David dash. He would cook her favorite dish, put on her favorite song, and wait. Even though he knew the meal would go cold that day, the Whitmore family never knew David. Not because he didn't exist, but because Elena was never allowed to bring him into the light. There were no photos of him in the house. No one ever asked her, "So who have you been traveling with lately?" No one was curious why she declined every family gathering. They simply assumed, if she didn't mention it, there was nothing to mention. David had once been Eleanor's whole world, but it was a world locked behind four walls, a love with no family portraits, no hand-holding in public, no blessings, just the two of them, and stories they told only to each other. Now, in the hospital room, the way David looked at Elena wasn't just filled with grief. It was the quiet ache of a man who had been hidden away for too long, yet still chose to stay until the very last breath. The small apartment they once shared didn't hold much furniture, but it held countless memories. It was an October afternoon. Pale golden sunlight spilled across the worn wooden floor. David sat on the sofa, holding 2 movie tickets to a film Elena had once said she wanted to see, a film she never got around to, and he knew she never would. Elena stepped out of the bedroom, dress in hand, avoiding his gaze. "My niece is getting married today. My mom asked me to represent the bride's side." David asked softly, "And what about me?" His voice held no accusation, no anger, just exhaustion. Elena stayed silent for a moment, then whispered, like it was a rehearsed line, "Next time, okay? I just don't want them to look at you like that." In that moment, no more words were needed. David stood up, walked into the bedroom, opened the suitcase he hadn't touched since moving in. He didn't throw things, he didn't cry, he didn't shout. He folded each shirt, tucked away each pair of socks, as if packing for a business trip. Eleanor stood at the doorway. She didn't try to stop him. She didn't dare. "Where are you going?" David answered, "Nowhere. I just don't want to live in a life where I have to be hidden." The suitcase closed. David walked past her. The scent of Elena's perfume on her neck was so familiar it made him turn his face away. He didn't slam the door. He closed it gently. But to Elena, it was the sharpest sound she had ever heard. From that day on, there were no more calls, no more texts, no more "Are you home yet?" No more "I'm waiting at the door." Only silence and an empty seat in the kitchen where no one ever sat again. The city at night wasn't as quiet as people imagined. The sound of passing cars, a distant wail of sirens, and the rain gently tapping against the window of the third-floor apartment where David now lived alone. He sat at the kitchen table. On the table were 2 mugs, one filled with hot tea, the other left empty. That empty mug had always sat across from him since the day he left Elena's apartment. He didn't know why he never put it away. Maybe he just couldn't. The clock read 1:47 a.m. The phone rang, a strange number. He didn't want to answer, but instinct made his hand reach out, as if he already knew this call was about to change everything. "Hello. Is this Mr. David Sinclair? I'm the attending physician at St. Adelaide Memorial Hospital. Patient Elena Whitmore was admitted in critical condition, stage 4 ovarian cancer." She only said one thing, "Call David." David didn't respond, didn't ask a single question. He just hung up, his hand trembling slightly, lips pressed tightly together. He stepped into the bedroom, opened the closet, and took out the old coat Elena had bought for him during their first winter together. The coat still smelled faintly of familiar soap, and something else he couldn't name. He packed lightly, carefully, because he knew the most important thing he had to bring was the courage to return. It was still raining. The old taxi rolled through the quiet streets, streetlights casting pale reflections across his face, calm on the outside but storming within. He asked himself, would she forgive me? Would I be too late? Would my presence be rejected again? And then came the clearest question of all. Would she still be there when I arrived? When the taxi stopped at the hospital gates, David didn't hesitate. He opened the door and stepped into the long, cold, sterile corridor, where his old love, hidden, wounded, but never dead, was waiting for him. One last time. The door to room 307 opened, without a knock. David stepped in, rain still clinging faintly to his shoulders, his shoes gliding silently across the gleaming tile floor. Inside, dim light spilled from the ceiling lamp, the scent of antiseptic, fresh flowers, and something else, the scent of something coming to an end. Elena lay there, her hair softly fanned out on the pillow, her face thinner now, but more delicate than ever. Her eyes closed, eyelashes casting faint shadows on her cheeks. Her chest rose and fell ever so slightly, each breath light as mist, as if she were convincing herself to hold on just a little longer. David said nothing. He simply pulled the chair close as he could, sat down, and held her hand, like he had so many times before. Only this time the hand was colder, frailer, but still hers, still his. He rested his forehead gently against hers and whispered softly, like speaking to a soul already halfway gone, "I'm here now. I came back, Elena. I know I once walked away. I know you once chose to keep me in the shadows, but you don't have to anymore. No one can stop me from loving you now." Outside the window, the rain began to let up. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, each beep like a quiet knock between two worlds. David pressed a kiss to her forehead. His eyes still glowed, but with a calm depth, as if he were embracing the most painful truth, and yet felt at peace. No one in that room had told him he could be there. No one from the Whitmore family had given their permission. There were no welcoming arms, no words of, "Thank you for coming." But he stayed, because true love does not wait to be invited. And when life is measured in hours, permission no longer matters. The sharp rhythm of high heels echoed down the hospital corridor. Vivian Whitmore entered, her posture as straight as an exclamation mark. Her makeup was flawless, her signature pearl necklace pulled tight against her neck. Trailing behind her was Father Jonathan Hale, the priest she had summoned for her daughter's final rites. She walked straight to the bedside, never once glancing at David. Her voice was calm, quiet, and cold as ice. "Father, please prepare for the blessing." She would want a final prayer. Father Hale gave a respectful nod, but just as he reached for his Bible, Vivian turned toward David for the first time since he'd arrived. "I think you should wait outside. This is a family matter." Those words, like an old knife pulled out and driven once more into a wound that never healed. The air in the room seemed to thin in an instant. Father Hale froze mid-motion. David said nothing. He didn't rise. He didn't protest. He simply held Eleanor's hand a little tighter. But then a voice came from the doorway, warm, steady, resolute. "I'm sorry, Mom, but she asked for him to stay." All eyes turned toward the speaker. It was Nurse Elena Torres, still in uniform, her name badge glinting under the light. She stepped into the room holding a slim folder, her gaze unwavering. Ms. Elena designated Mr. David Sinclair as her legal spouse in her medical directive, and she stated clearly if she couldn't wake up, he was to be the one by her side. Vivian went rigid. Her hand tightened around her purse, but she said nothing. Father Hale looked from her to David, and then this time he asked, "Mr. Sinclair, would you like to join in the final blessing for her?" David nodded, not out of courtesy, not because her family had acknowledged him, but because he knew Elena had chosen him, even if they never did. The room fell into silence. Not the usual kind, but the kind that descends when all masks have dropped, and no excuse left can stand on its own. Nurse Elena Torres placed the folder on the bedside table, opened it, and gently pointed to the very top. This is the medical directive signed by Ms. Elena Whitmore upon admission, confirming the legal representative, David Sinclair, spouse. The word spouse, bold black ink, stood clear and precise. Below it, Elena's signature, delicate and unmistakable in every familiar stroke. Vivian Whitmore stood frozen. Her back still straight, chin held high, but her gaze had begun to falter. As if she were asking herself, when did this happen? How did this slip beyond my control? Henry Whitmore looked down at the floor. His hand slid into his pocket, fingers curling into a silent fist. He said nothing, but for the first time, he was no longer fully standing by his wife. David remained seated, no smile, no glance at anyone. He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a thin folder yellowed with age. He opened it without haste, as if the folds in the paper had already been memorized by his hands 1,000 times. Then he turned it toward the light, gently set it on the table, and kept his hand resting beside Eleanor. This is our marriage certificate. Waverley County Courthouse, April 14th, 7 years ago. No one spoke, not even Father Jonathan Hale, who stood holding his open Bible, could keep his eyes from blinking in disbelief at the papers in front of him. Nurse Elena gave a quiet, respectful nod. Vivian leaned slightly forward. She looked at Elena Dash, then down at her daughter's hand. The small silver wedding ring was still there. It had never left her finger. She had just never truly looked. No one could deny it now, not through posture, not through silence, not through pride, not through a too-late refusal. David folded the paper and returned it to his coat. As if he had never needed anyone's approval, he turned back and gripped Elena's hand, like a husband fulfilling the final wish of his wife. No permission needed, no recognition required, just the will to be there. Father Jonathan Hale gently closed his Bible. He glanced around the room. A room where no one objected anymore, no one spoke. There was only one kind of silence now, the kind that arrives when everyone understands. But no one wants to say it out loud. David Sinclair remained in his seat, exactly where he belonged. No one had invited him, but no one dared to ask him to leave again. He didn't say, "She chose me." He didn't declare, "I'm her husband." He didn't need to point to the paper again or repeat the legal evidence, because the most important thing Elena left behind wasn't her signature. It was her trust. He placed his hand gently on Elena's chest, where her heartbeat faded softly beneath the steady beeping of the monitor. And he whispered, like a prayer meant for no one but the two of them, "You don't have to apologize. I've understood for a long time. I never needed you to make it public. I only wanted you to be happy, even if it was in the dark." Across the room, Rachel Whitmore, Eleanor's younger sister, stood still. For the first time, she truly looked at David, not with the confused eyes of an outsider, but with the gaze of someone who finally saw what had always been there, for 7 years. Vivian, meanwhile, turned her face away. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. But her hand released the purse she had been gripping tightly for so long, a small gesture. But perhaps it was all she could offer. In that moment, Father Hale bowed his head, his voice soft as mist. "Let us pray for Elena." David nodded gently, not as a believer, but as a husband, sending his wife off with the only thing left that truly mattered, peace. The funeral ended beneath a sky washed in dull silver grey. A light breeze rustled through the oak trees outside the church. Condolences were polite, the service was orderly, but no one mentioned David, not a word. That evening, in the old Whitmore family home, Rachel, Eleanor's younger sister, quietly stepped into her sister's study. Everything remained just as Elena had left it. Books arranged alphabetically, picture frames turned face down, and a soft amber desk lamp glowing gently in the corner. For reasons she couldn't explain, Rachel walked to the wooden desk. She leaned down and opened the bottom drawer, the one Elena had always kept private since they were kids. Inside were only 2 items, a weathered blue notebook and a thin, cream-colored envelope with familiar slanted handwriting. "To my family, Please read only after I'm gone." Rachel froze. Her hands trembled. She picked up the letter and slowly walked into the living room, where Vivian and Henry sat in silence, each with a cup of cold tea. She didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for a nod. She simply sat down, placed the envelope on the table, and said quietly, "Elena left this. I think everyone should hear it." The room fell still. Vivian squinted at the handwriting on the envelope, then looked away. Henry said nothing, only nodded slowly. Rachel opened the envelope with both hands, carefully. As though opening her sister's heart itself, she took a deep breath, then began to read. Her voice was soft, but each word sliced through the air. "If you're reading this letter, it means I'm no longer here. I hesitated for a long time about whether to write it. But in the end, I didn't want to leave in silence. There are things I kept inside for too long, like the fact that none of you ever truly knew David, my husband. Not because I was ashamed, but because I was afraid. Afraid of cold stares, of whispered rumors. I hid him, to protect him from the same looks I used to receive at our family dinners." No one said a word, only the faint rustle of paper in Rachel's hands. Vivian stared at the tea table, her hands gripping tightly. "You all thought I lived alone, but I was never lonely. He was the one who made me soup when I was sick. The one who held me when I cried after Mom's judgments. The one who walked away when I didn't have the courage to bring him into your world." Rachel's voice cracked. She wiped her tears, but continued, "A year ago, I found out I was sick, and I told no one. I didn't want the world to show up out of obligation. I chose to spend my final months with the one person I believed would never leave me." Henry lowered his head, cleaning his glasses with a handkerchief, even though there was no dust. Vivian turned away again, but this time she didn't say, "That's enough." She was listening. David was the only family I could truly lean on, and if you still believe he was a mistake, then I'm sorry. But he was the mistake I chose, and I never regretted it. He was the one I wanted holding my hand as I took my final breath. And he did just that, without needing anyone's permission. When Rachel folded the letter, no one applauded. No one said, "That was beautiful." But something had shifted. In that room, for the first time, Elena was fully present, not hidden, not spoken over, not edited, just herself, in her own voice. Rachel remained seated. The letter in her hands was now creased at the corners, damp from tears soaked through her fingertips. But she kept reading, not for herself, but because Elena deserved to have her voice heard. "Mom, I know you never really asked me, who is David? But I still want to answer. He's the only one who never judged me, the first person who didn't try to mold me into some perfect Elena you always wanted, the one who stayed up all night just to listen when I had no one else to call." Vivian didn't look at Rachel, but her eyes began to glisten. Very subtly, she leaned forward as if to hear more clearly, or as if a part of her heart had finally begun to slip through the wall she'd built for years. "You always thought I hid him out of shame. But that wasn't the truth. I hid him because I knew you would never look at him with fairness. I couldn't bear to see the man I loved be reduced to a waiter, a nobody, someone beneath our status. I heard things like, 'My daughter deserves better than that. Don't taint the Whitmore bloodline.' And each time I chose silence, to protect him from being hurt." Henry lifted his gaze then, his eyes fixed on the empty space ahead, as though seeing a version of Elena he had never known. Not the obedient daughter, but a woman who had fought quietly and suffered alone. Rachel took a shaky breath and continued, her voice nearly breaking. "I hid him in family photos, hid him during home visits, hid him when I won awards, when I was sick, when I felt alone, and he never once complained. Did you know? That time you organized the charity fundraiser, David was the one who quietly donated $500, under the name Someone Who Doesn't Need to Be Thanked." The words rang through the room like a silent slap. No one said a thing, but one thing was certain. No one in that house could deny the love Elena had lived for, ever again. Rachel placed the letter on the table, her hands trembling. Vivian looked at her youngest daughter, and for the first time all evening, she spoke. "Yeah, I didn't know. I truly didn't know." She didn't finish the sentence. Perhaps she couldn't. Perhaps it was too late to apologize, but not too late to finally understand. Henry placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. No excuses, just a slow, heavy grip. From a father who had failed to see his daughter while she was still alive, Rachel gently reopened the letter. Her voice no longer trembled. Only stillness remained, as if every other sound in the room had quieted, to let Elena speak. "A year ago, I learned I didn't have much time left, and I decided to do something I'd always wanted. Do you know what I chose, Mom? I married David, again, not to sign another document, but to declare to whatever little corner of the world would hear me that I chose him, and I never chose wrong." It was an early morning at Waverly Bay. The ocean breeze danced through the hem of the simple white dress Elena had picked for herself. David stood by the water's edge, wearing a suit he had kept from a job interview years ago. No music, no cake, no blessings from family. Just the two of them, and 2 whispered vows beneath the first light of day. He cried during the ceremony, and I laughed because for the first time in my life, I didn't have to hide what made me happy. I knew that day would be the last time I could stand tall, look him in the eyes, and say, "I'm your wife." And no one can take that moment from me. In the Whitmore living room, Vivian wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet stream of tears. Because for the first time, she realized her daughter had lived and died in a way she had never understood. Rachel continued, her voice tightening on the final lines. "If any of you still believe David wasn't family, that's your right to believe. But to me, he was the place I wanted to return to when I left this world. And he gave me that, without anyone's permission, without needing a seat at the funeral, without applause. Just a hand holding mine as I closed my eyes for the last time. Now no one in the room could look away. No one could pretend that love hadn't existed. And more than anything, no one could deny this. The daughter they thought they knew so well had lived a life of quiet, unwavering courage. That afternoon, the southern city cemetery was nearly empty. There was no rain, only the wind, rustling through the trees, sending a few leaves drifting onto the white gravel path that wound toward the hill's end. David Sinclair walked slowly along the trail, holding a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. Eleanor's favorite. She once said they were unpretentious, but gentle enough to be remembered forever. No one walked beside him, and he didn't need anyone to. The small headstone rested quietly in the shade of an old elm tree. Simple. No photo, just an inscription. Elena Whitmore, loved deeply, and was loved just the same. David knelt down, brushing aside the golden leaves scattered across the stone. He gently laid the flowers at the base of the grave, then reached into his coat pocket and took out an old photo. It wasn't high quality, a blurry snapshot from the first time they went to the beach. Elena in a straw hat, smiling wide, David squinting against the sun, mid-laugh. They hadn't posed, they were just happy. He placed the photo next to the flowers, weighing it down with a small stone. Then he sat down beside her, quietly. "I'm here, Eleanor. This time, no one's stopping me. No walls between us, no reason left to step back. No cameras, no audience, no documents or titles. Just one man, and the only woman he had ever loved. Even if she was no longer there." He bowed his head and closed his eyes. Not to beg, not to blame, only to whisper, "You once said one day you'd let them know. You did it, and I forgave you long ago. Truth is, I never really held it against you." The wind passed gently over his shoulder, carrying the soft scent of flowers and damp earth. A quiet peace settled, not through words, but through presence. David didn't cry, because this love didn't need pity. It only needed to be lived truthfully, until the very end. At the far edge of the cemetery, beyond the willow trees casting long shadows over the path, a car came to a quiet stop. The door opened, and out stepped a young woman in medical scrubs. Nurse Elena Torres. She hadn't come to find David. She was visiting her grandfather's grave, a ritual she kept at the end of each month. But today, something made her linger a little longer. From a distance, she saw a black man in an old coat kneeling alone before a small headstone. He wasn't crying, he wasn't speaking, he just sat there, with a stillness so profound it felt almost touchable. Beside him lay a bouquet of white flowers and a small photo held down by a stone. Elena couldn't see his face from where she stood, but somehow she saw something shining from within him, more clearly than anything else around. She placed a hand over her chest, where her heart had begun to slow. Not from sadness, but because something in that moment made her want to be still. She didn't call out. She didn't walk closer. She quietly turned and headed back to her car, then stopped, pulled out her phone, and dialed a familiar number. "Hello? Dad? No, nothing's wrong. I just wanted to say, I love you." On the other end, her father's voice was surprised. "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" Elena smiled softly, her eyes stinging for reasons she couldn't quite explain. "It is. I just realized there are things I haven't said in a long time. And today I saw something that made me not want to wait until it's too late." In the distance, David still sat there, unaware that his quiet act had stirred another heart. He didn't know someone was watching. And he didn't need to, because real love doesn't need a spotlight. It only needs to be strong enough to reach the hearts it was meant for. Late afternoon settled over the cemetery like a soft grey-gold blanket. The last rays of sunlight slanted through the old elm branches, casting their glow upon the headstone that read, "Elena Whitmore, loved deeply and was loved just the same." David Sinclair was still there, but his shoulders no longer carried the weight they once did. He said nothing. He didn't need to whisper regrets. He didn't ask for forgiveness, because everything that needed to be spoken, Elena had already said in her letter through the choice she made with her whole heart. A breeze passed through. The small photo beside the bouquet of white chrysanthemums fluttered gently. Sunlight caught the glossy edge, and for a moment Elena's smiling eyes lit up once more, as if she had never left. David stood, brushed the dust from his knees. He looked down at the grave one last time. Not as a goodbye, but as a promise, "I'll live the rest, for both of us." He turned and walked away, not hurried, not bowed, but with the quiet stride of a man who knew he had been truly loved, and had loved fully in return. Behind him, the wind played in the leaves. A photograph, a bouquet, a simple headstone, and a love that needed no grand ceremony to prove itself, only silent, unwavering devotion through the years. No voices challenged him now, no suspicious stares, no more questions. "Who are you? Why are you here?" Because now the world, or at least the part of it that mattered most, knew he was not a stranger. Love doesn't need an invitation, doesn't require the right suit, or the right seat at the table. It only asks to be present and to stay until the very end. On the gravestone, sunlight filtered through the leaves. A single beam fell across the inscription, "Loved deeply and was loved just the same." A love song without melody, without a stage. Only one quiet, unshakable conclusion. Love doesn't ask permission. It simply arrives and remains. Not every love is welcomed with applause, and not every lover gets a seat at the family table. David never asked for those things. He simply held her hand and stayed until the very end. If you've ever known someone who loved quietly, but was never allowed to be named, someone who was always there, but never acknowledged, or if you have been that someone, leave a comment below. True love doesn't ask for permission. And if this story made you see farewells differently, made you think of a promise left unkept, or reminded you of a love kept hidden but held strong until the very end, share this video, because somewhere out there may be a David still waiting to be heard.